kindly inviting me to this wonderful winter school. And it's got an excellent program, which I'm very fortunate to be a part of, and it's in a wonderful location. And the second time I've been to an Austrian ski resort. I would also like to start with a slight apology, because I'll probably start getting faster and faster as the presentation goes through. So I apologise if I talk too fast and lose some of you, but I will share my slides afterwards, so you can browse them at a leisure place. So I'm going to start by asking you to think of two numbers, okay, just to set the scene. So this first number is how many papers you think are published every year now across the whole of science. Okay, now the second number I'd like you to think of is how many you would claim to read in 1 year. Okay? So how many are published across the whole of science, and how many would you tell me that you read? So you might be surprised to hear that this first number is between 2 and 3 million now, and this is increasing every year, so it's a tremendous number. Now the second number is interesting. Sometimes I ask people in the crowd to shout out numbers, but we also conduct surveys, and people generally say between 250 and maybe 300 papers they read in a year. And I think read in this context is skimming the title abstracting figures. But even so, you can see there's a huge discrepancy between these two numbers. It's impossible to keep up to date with everything in science. It's difficult just to keep up with things within your own field at times. And these millions of papers, that's the reason why there are so many different publishers, and why all these publishers have so many different journals. At the moment, that's the system that we use to distribute all of this. So I'm going to talk about the role of the Nature journals in this landscape. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware that Nature is quite an old journal. It was launched back in November 1869. It's not the oldest journal by a very long way, by several hundred years. But we did recently celebrate our 150th birthday. And the mission that we had when we first launched, it's still the same mission that we have today, and it has two parts. So the first is to communicate science to scientists working in other fields. Okay, so how can physicists get some exposure about the things that are exciting in chemistry and biology? But the second component is communicating science to the general public. That's what we were set up to do, and it's still something we're trying to do today. I mentioned that we turned 150 very recently, so there was a special issue that we did, doing an analysis of all the papers published during that period, and I'd encourage you to take a look if you haven't seen it. There's lots of different stats that are quite interesting to skim through. Okay, so for most of Nature's history, it was the only journal that we had, but now that is very much not the case, so I want to quickly introduce some of the journals. So Nature itself publishes every week. It publishes, it's around 900 papers a year now. This number is slowly increasing. And it's publishing papers across the whole of science, trying to publish the most significant advances that we can and showcase them to as many people as we can. We also have a tier of journals now that are called the Nature-branded research journals. So these are journals like Nature Physics, Materials. These journals are different in a few ways. Firstly, they publish just every month, not every week. They publish a lot less papers, between 100 and 150 papers every year. But the big difference is the target audience for these journals. So Nature is really trying to hit things into the mainstream and grab the attention of as many people as we can. Each one of these journals was launched with a particular community in mind. So these journals first started to appear in the 90s. 1992 was the first time Nature had a sister journal. And so during the 90s, we launched various ones in the life sciences, and it wasn't until 2002 that Nature Materials was launched. And each one of these journals was launched for a specific community, so material scientists, or physicists, or chemists. So quite a different scope to Nature itself, but still very broad scoped journals. The latest addition to the group is Nature Communications, where I started 7 years ago. So this channel is different in a few ways, and in one very important way. So most of these channels are still printed, but Nature Communications is online only, so it just publishes content every day. It publishes across all fields of science, so it's more than 5,000 papers a year now. It's actually very close to 6,000, I think. That sounds like a big number, but if you added up the papers published in all the research journals, it's quite similar. But the big difference between Nature Communications and the others is that it's an open access journal. So you pay to publish there, and then everybody can read it and distribute it and do what they want. So that's the big difference, and it's trying to publish things that people in the community are going to find interesting and that are going to appeal to a broader audience, but maybe the papers might not have quite the appeal of the other Nature journals. Okay, so Nature Communications is the only open access journal that we have, but I should just mention that all of the content on nature.com can be read for free by everybody. So for every piece of content, we provide a link. So the authors and anyone with a subscription can generate these links, and they can freely be distributed and clicked, and anyone can read it. So we often give these links to the press for when they're writing about our papers. So I said that Nature was the only journal we had for a very, very long time. Now there are close to 60 journals with Nature in the name. And we're launching maybe 3 a year, and we have done for the past few years. Most of these launches at the moment are in kind of like an applied sciences area. So journals like Nature Electronics, Nature Catalysis, Machine Intelligence, and I suspect this is going to continue going forwards. But as I said, most of the journals are still subscription-based. Okay, so why would you want to publish with us? We're not just an outlet for research papers. There's lots of different types of content that we have, discussing all the different issues in science and things that might affect scientists. So hopefully we're kind of advocates and voices for people working in science fields. There's close to 10 million people that come to Nature every month now. So we have a huge readership. And as I say, we work very hard to try to get things into the mainstream media. So every year there are hundreds of thousands of stories written about our content in thousands of different outlets. Okay, I just wanted to give a few tips for writing for journals with a broad readership. So the key thing to remember if you're writing for a journal with a broad readership is that not everyone's going to understand the details, and actually most people who read your paper are not going to understand details or care about the details. But that shouldn't matter. Everybody should be able to look at a paper and understand why it's significant. So everybody should be able to pick up an abstract, understand what the main advance is, understand what they're learning, what's new, and why that's significant. But this doesn't mean that you have to hype. If you're having to hype your work, it means that the presentation's probably not being done well enough, because you shouldn't have to do this. So great papers tell great stories, and you just need to make sure that you have a very clear and robust message. There is actually a piece published by one of my colleagues last year, which is all about tips and advice to kind of make your life easier while going through the review process. So if you haven't seen this, I would strongly encourage you to do it. It's by Mike White, who's the climate change editor. So he talks about formatting and layout, writing, data and figures. So just as an example, he discusses abstracts. And actually, a lot of people don't realize that at Nature, many of the abstracts are rewritten by the editors, people like myself. And we all work to a template. We kind of have a formula for Nature abstracts. And this is just designed so that people who are non-experts can read an abstract and appreciate why something's significant. So you can find this online, but as I say, we'll also distribute the slides afterwards. There are lots of other tips and advice that Mike provides around things like titles, how you can structure sentences and use transition words. There's like small tips that you can use to make your paper more engaging and more likely that people are going to want to keep reading. And there's also material online that you can find out through the Nature Masterclasses. Okay, but most of the time I travel, people ask me, how does a paper go from my desk to being published in Nature? What's the process? How can I, get my work in there? Are there any tricks? So I wanted to quickly talk through the core steps. So before you submit to any journal, you should always have a look at the kind of policies. And you only really need to submit your manuscript, but you have the option of submitting a cover letter. So I should mention that at the Nature journals, many of the editors, they assess the manuscripts first before they go to the cover letter. So it's not like the first thing that people are going to see, but a good cover letter can make your life easier. And you have to think about what the job is of the editor. So the editor is trying to publish content that their readers are going to find interesting. Okay, so in the cover letter, you need to explain how what you've done is in advance, where it fits in the landscape, and why you think that's going to be of interest to the readers of the journal. Okay, just put yourself in the shoes of the editor and just think, what information would they need in order to, to get as excited about my work as I am. And again, we have some material online around, tips for cover letters. Okay, but in real terms, if you have a manuscript and you submit through our submission system, what happens is that it goes into the journal's inbox, and all of the Nature journals have separate inboxes. And what makes the Nature journals quite unusual and quite unique for an academic journal is that all of the decisions and all the content is handled by full-time professional editors, so people like myself who have to leave academia, we're retrained as editors, and we have control over the content. So we decide what goes out for review and ultimately what's published. We don't have an editorial board. The only time we reach out to academics is when we're going through the review process. So what happens is that your paper goes into an inbox, and then people like myself, so I'm leading the team at Nature that's responsible for physics and material science and electronics. So it's just a team of 5 of us. So all the submissions that come into Nature that are in physical sciences, I will see them. Either allocate an editor, someone in my team, or I will be the handling editor. And it's likely that you'll always be interacting with the same people in the Nature journals because they'll be responsible for particular areas. And the editors will only see 1 or 2 new manuscripts every day. It's not that we're drowning in papers. There's only 1 or 2 new submissions that we get. And as the number of submissions increases, we just hire more people. There's a limit as to how much one person can handle. So an editor is assigned. They will read the paper. They will go through the literature. And they will map out the landscape, and they need to decide, how much of an advance, what's the advance in this paper compared to what's out there. And then they need to decide whether they send it out for review. So the company actually asks me and my colleagues to do this within 8 days. And I am sorry if some of my colleagues are slower than this. You should reach out to them and try to speed them up. Now they're looking for a number of things. There's a number of reasons why we might consider a paper. It might be conceptually very novel. It might be conceptually have no novelty, but it's got potential practical applications. There's a number of reasons, so there's no secret formula I can give you, unfortunately. If we do send the paper for review, no, sorry, I was going to say that actually, in terms of the percentage of papers we send out for review, it's around 20% on most of the journals. It's about 30 in Nature Communications, but all the others it's around 20. Which unfortunately means that the vast majority are rejected at the first stage by just 1 or maybe 2 internal editors like myself. If we do reject a paper, we should tell you why, but I'm sorry, sometimes we're quite concise. If you ever want more information, don't be afraid to go back to the editor to ask for more. And if we send a paper out for review, we need to select referees. Now, at the Nature journals, we don't actually have a referee database, so this is all very manual. So we first go through the manuscripts and we decide the different elements that we want feedback on. So maybe we say, okay, we want someone familiar with synthesizing a certain material or with a particular experimental technique or computational approach. So we first identify the elements, and then we will allocate people we think would be good for that. So it might be people we've previously interacted with, either by the journal or at conferences, or people we've come across through the literature. Or if your suggestions line up, we could use some of your suggestions. But if you ever suggest or exclude referees, it's always best to explain why you're recommending them or excluding them. Otherwise, it might be less likely that the editors use them if they don't understand the relationship or they don't know why you've recommended somebody. Okay, so if we send a paper out for review, we normally ask referees to come back to us within 1 or 2 weeks. And it typically takes about 4 weeks to get the reports back. Sorry for this. But when the reports are back, we have to make a decision. So the editors need to look at all of the comments, look at the expertise of the referees, and then come to a final decision. So if we have 3 reports, all that say that they don't think a paper is appropriate for us, we can still publish that paper, okay? We can't ignore technical comments. So if there are serious doubts over the strengths of claims, we can't ignore that. But opinions, referees have, they always have different opinions, so it's the editor's job to decide, the way forward for a paper. We can either reject something after review or invite a revision. If we do invite a revision, it doesn't mean you have to do everything that the referees are saying. Referees want to pull papers in different directions. So hopefully the editor is guiding you as to what it is that they want to see. Or if you don't want to do something the referees are asking, just explain why. And you can always use the cover letter, which is your link to the editor. You can always explain maybe why something is challenging or maybe beyond the scope. Or if you have any concerns over the referees, you can just flag them in the cover letter. So typically a paper will go through 2, maybe 3 rounds of review. We want this process to be as fast and painless as possible. We'll give referees whatever information we think they need in order to do their job. And if we need to add people during the process, we will do this. Although we try not to because it slows things down. And then once we've looped through a couple of times, we need to make a decision. So as I mentioned, it's the editors that ultimately decide. It's very rare at Nature that we get 3 positive referees. So we ultimately have to decide what action we're going to take. And the overall acceptance rate is about 10%. So this is of the original papers that are submitted. So I mentioned that around 20% are sent out for review. So it's a kind of 50-50 once you've got past the editor as to whether something is accepted or rejected. After we click the accept and send it over to our colleagues, there's lots of things that happen. There's a lot of people in the background at Nature, as well as the kind of core editors like myself. There's a huge production team and art team. So all of the figures are redrawn for all of the Nature papers by in-house art editors. At Nature we have copy editors that go through every sentence to make sure that the language is good, all the symbols are defined, all of these things. So a big operation, and then we have a press team that works really hard to get it into the popular press. And I should say that, so at Nature, just Nature alone, there's more than 100 people that work on the magazine. But across all of the Nature journals, there are more than 400 editors now. So it's a very big operation. So I'm pleased to hear in the last talk that data availability was flagged, because it's something that at the Nature journals we very much encourage. So the papers are really just telling the story, but the things underlying the story is all the data. So every Nature paper now, we have to have a data availability statement. So as a minimum, if we ever request data, you have to provide it. But ideally, we would love for you to actually make it publicly available. And I mentioned a lot of the Nature journals, which some of you may have interacted with. There may be occasions where you'd like to transfer between the journals. So either if your paper is not sent out for review or rejected after review. Sometimes you'll see that the editors, they make a recommendation in their rejection letter. Now this is something that they manually do. So the decision will lie with the new journal, and all of the journals are independent. But there's a good chance that our colleagues will follow our advice. So if you ever do see an endorsement, there's a good chance that the receiving journal will follow the advice. Just a little bit of advice though. If you transfer after review, the new journal gets all of the information that the previous journal had. So if you're not in a good situation with referees, things are a bit awkward and sticky and slow, it may be in your best interest to just submit fresh. So at the Nature journals you can do this, it's not a problem to, if you have a bad experience with one journal, you can submit to a different journal, you don't have to tell them, they're all independent. And don't be afraid to appeal. I do this as a day job, appeals I see every day, I'm not going to be offended, I'm not going to take it personally. If you appeal, it's fine. After review, you have to remember the editors trust the referee's comments. So if a referee is not correct, please do let us know. We don't want to reject something inappropriately. So just explain to us why the referees are wrong, and ideally show why, and then we can consider something further. But appealing something, if you submit your work and the editor doesn't send it out for review, and you want to appeal that, and say, look, I disagree, I think that the paper is appropriate for the journal. Well, then we can agree to disagree, but ultimately it's the editor's decision. So if you want to get a different decision, my advice for you is to extend the paper. Do something substantial that's going to make the editor think. Don't just do cosmetics changes like improving the writing, because that's irrelevant for us, because the writing's improved later anyway. So if you want a different decision, do something that's going to maybe force the editor to think again. Also, there's a lot of young people here, so I'd encourage you to think about this as a career. It's a great way to be involved in science without having to click any buttons and do any actual science. It's a very fun job. We get to do lots of things other than just read papers. There's lots of travel and lots of different projects we can do. Lots of science outreach. And we have offices all around the world. Sadly, we don't have one in Korea. The closest is Shanghai. But it is a good job. So if you're interested, please do come and talk to me. And I should say that I'm here for the whole meeting. So if you don't want to ask questions now, you can also ask me at some point during the week. Just grab me. And with that, I'll say thank you very much.